In the quiet, mist-covered woods surrounding the old Victorian house, something dark was waiting. For years, the townspeople had whispered about the strange history of the house, but Julia and Stephen dismissed it as superstition until their daughter, Sarah, found the forgotten doll hidden in the attic. What began as innocent fascination soon turned into something far more sinister. The whispers started at night, followed by the chilling sound of footsteps down the hall, and then, Sarah vanished. Now, with each passing day, the presence in the house grows stronger, its haunting grip closing in on Julia. Somewhere in the shadows, a pair of glassy eyes watches, and a chilling voice calls out from the darkness. But is it too late to save her daughter, or has Sarah already become part of the dollmaker's legacy? At the end of this video you will know what happened to them, but before we start, I would like to introduce you to our channel. Our channel publishes educational content, horror stories, self-motivation. If you are interested, subscribe to our channel and activate the bell button to receive the latest videos. Let the light fall and darkness come. Sarah had always loved dolls. She had a collection of them, carefully lined up on the shelves in her room, each with its own name and personality. Her parents, Julia and Stephen, often found her sitting on the floor, having long conversations with her dolls, as though they were her best friends. Her favorite was a beautiful porcelain doll with a silk dress and soft curls that her grandmother had given her when she was a baby. When the family moved into their new house, a large Victorian-style home at the edge of a small, quiet town, Sarah was thrilled to have more space for her dolls. The house was old, full of dark corners and creaky floors, but it had a certain charm that Julia found endearing. Stephen, however, had been uneasy about the house from the start. Stephen said the house felt off, like there was something wrong with it. Julia had laughed, saying it was just the age of the place, that all old houses had their quirks. But Sarah loved it. Her new room was bigger than any she'd had before, with large windows that looked out into the misty woods behind the house. She immediately started unpacking her dolls, carefully placing them on the shelves that Stephen had built for her. But there was one thing that Sarah hadn't expected. On their first night in the house, as Sarah was exploring the attic, she found something strange. In a dark, forgotten corner of the attic, behind old boxes and broken furniture, was a doll. It was unlike any doll Sarah had ever seen. It sat upright on an old, dusty chair, its eyes wide and staring. The doll's face was eerily lifelike, almost too real, with pale skin, delicate features, and long black hair. Its clothes, though tattered and faded, were once clearly exquisite, a deep crimson dress with lace trim. Sarah called for her mother, her voice echoing through the dark attic. Julia came up the stairs, wiping her hands on a towel. Julia asked what Sarah had found. Sarah pointed to the doll, her eyes wide with excitement. She said it was so beautiful, so perfect, and that it must have belonged to the people who lived there before. Julia frowned as she looked at the doll. There was something unsettling about it, something that made her feel a cold shiver run down her spine. Julia said maybe they should leave it in the attic. She added that old things like that should probably stay where they are. But Sarah insisted. She begged to take the doll to her room, to add it to her collection. Julia sighed and gave in, though she still couldn't shake the strange feeling. She watched as Sarah carried the doll carefully down to her room, like it was the most precious thing in the world. That night, as Sarah slept, the house seemed different. The air felt heavier, and the usual creaks and groans were louder, more insistent. Julia lay awake in bed, listening to the sounds of the house settling. Stephen was asleep beside her, snoring lightly, but something kept her from drifting off. It was a feeling, a nagging sense of dread she couldn't explain. In the middle of the night, Julia heard a sound that made her sit up straight in bed. It was the sound of small footsteps, padding softly down the hallway. Julia whispered Stephen's name, shaking him awake. She said someone was walking around. Stephen groaned, still half asleep, and told her it was probably just Sarah going to the bathroom. But Julia wasn't so sure. The footsteps didn't sound like Sarah. They were too slow, too deliberate, and they seemed to stop just outside their bedroom door. Julia held her breath, waiting for the door to creak open, but after a few moments, the footsteps moved on, fading down the hallway toward Sarah's room. Julia's heart raced. She slipped out of bed as quietly as she could, tiptoeing to the door. She opened it just a crack and peered out into the dark hallway. There was no one there, but the door to Sarah's room was open slightly, a thin sliver of light from her nightlight spilling into the hallway. Julia whispered for Sarah, but there was no response. She stepped into the hallway, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor. As she approached Sarah's room, she heard something that made her blood run cold. It was the sound of whispering, soft, almost inaudible, but it was there, coming from inside the room. Julia slowly pushed the door open. Sarah was fast asleep in her bed, tucked under her blankets, but the doll, the one from the attic, was no longer sitting on the shelf where Sarah had placed it. It was sitting on the floor, facing the bed, its head tilted slightly to the side, as though it were watching Sarah sleep. Julia felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She quickly picked up the doll and placed it back on the shelf, her hands trembling. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that it was just a doll, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next morning, Julia told Stephen about what had happened. He laughed it off, saying she was just stressed from the move, that she was letting her imagination get the best of her. Stephen said there was no way a doll could move on its own. But that didn't explain the whispering, or the footsteps. Over the next few days, strange things continued to happen. Sarah would often find the doll in different places around her room, even though she swore she hadn't moved it. Once, she found it sitting at her desk, with a pencil in its hand, as though it had been trying to write something. Another time, Julia found it lying at the foot of Sarah's bed, its glassy eyes staring up at the ceiling. Sarah, however, didn't seem to mind. In fact, she seemed to grow more and more attached to the doll. She would sit for hours, talking to it, whispering secrets in its ear, as though the doll could understand her. Julia tried to intervene, but Sarah grew defensive whenever she suggested putting the doll back in the attic. Sarah said the doll's name was Emily and that she was her new best friend. She added that Emily didn't want to go back to the attic. She wanted to stay with her. Julia asked Sarah how she knew the doll's name. Sarah said Emily had told her. Julia's heart skipped a beat. She tried to laugh it off, but the unease settled deeper in her chest. That night, Julia and Stephen were woken by the sound of something shattering. They rushed into Sarah's room to find her standing in the middle of the room, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. The doll, Emily, was lying on the floor, surrounded by shards of broken glass from the window. The cold night air blew in, making the curtains flutter. Julia ran to Sarah, asking her what had happened. Sarah said that Emily had tried to leave, that she had heard her moving in the night. She said she had seen the doll walking toward the window, as if trying to escape. Stephen muttered something about nightmares, but Julia felt something darker was at play. In the days that followed, Sarah grew quieter, more withdrawn. She spent less time with her other dolls and more time with Emily. Julia noticed strange marks on Sarah's arms, small scratches and bruises that Sarah couldn't explain. And then, one night, Sarah disappeared. Julia and Stephen searched the entire house, calling her name, but there was no sign of her. The police were called, and the entire village helped in the search, but Sarah was gone without a trace. In the chaos of the search, no one had noticed the doll. No one had noticed that Emily, too, had vanished. Weeks passed, and Julia spiraled into despair. She refused to leave the house, convinced that Sarah was still there, somewhere. One night, as Julia sat in Sarah's room, staring at the empty shelves. She heard the sound of soft footsteps, padding down the hallway. Julia whispered for Sarah, her voice trembling with hope and fear. The footsteps stopped at the door. Slowly, it creaked open, and there, standing in the doorway, was Emily. The doll's glass eyes glinted in the dim light, and in the stillness of the room, Julia could hear it whispering, faint and sinister. Julia backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. The doll took a step forward, its porcelain feet tapping lightly on the wooden floor. Julia froze, her body trembling as a deep, unnatural chill swept through the room. The air seemed to thicken with an invisible weight, pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. The doll's eyes, dark and glassy, locked onto hers. Julia tried to call for Stephen, but her voice wouldn't come. She was paralyzed, staring at the thing that had taken her daughter. In the suffocating silence, the whispers grew louder, though they didn't come from the doll's mouth. They seemed to echo from the walls, the floor, the very air around her. The doll moved closer, one delicate foot after another, its crimson dress swishing softly. And as it did, Julia saw something that made her heart stop. There, in the shadows just beyond the doll, something was moving, a small, pale hand reaching out from the darkness. It was Sarah. Julia's breath hitched as she saw her daughter's face, pale and gaunt, peeking out from behind the doll. But there was something wrong with her eyes. They were blank, void of any life, just like the doll's eyes. Julia said Sarah's name, her voice shaking with desperation, pleading for her to come back. But Sarah didn't respond. She stood there, expressionless, her hand resting on the doll's shoulder, as though they were connected somehow, as though the doll had become a part of her. Julia took a step forward, her heart pounding in her ears. She had to save Sarah. She had to pull her away from the thing that had stolen her daughter from her. As Julia reached out, the whispers swelled, filling her mind with dark, incomprehensible voices. The shadows around her seemed to shift, twisting and writhing like living things. The doll smiled a cruel, lifeless smile, and the air around Julia grew colder, heavy with a malevolent presence. The doll's head tilted, and in a voice that was not Sarah's but was somehow her own, it spoke. It was a soft, hollow whisper, the words cutting through the air like glass. The doll said Sarah wasn't coming back. Julia screamed, lunging forward, but the shadows seemed to rise up, pulling her back, their cold grip wrapping around her arms and legs like icy chains. She struggled, tears streaming down her face, but no matter how hard she fought, she couldn't reach Sarah. The doll's smile widened, its eyes glittering with malice, as it turned and began to walk back into the darkness, Sarah following behind, her movements slow and mechanical, like a puppet on strings. The door to Sarah's room slammed shut with a deafening crash, and Julia was left standing there, alone in the dark. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Stephen found her like that hours later, crumpled on the floor, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. He tried to comfort her, but Julia couldn't speak, couldn't explain what she had seen. Days turned into weeks, but Sarah was never found. The police searched the house, the attic, the woods behind the home, but there was no trace of the little girl or the doll. Julia and Stephen eventually moved away, consumed by grief and guilt. But even in their new home, far from the village, far from the cursed house, Julia would sometimes wake in the middle of the night to the sound of small footsteps padding softly down the hallway. She would lie there, frozen in terror, knowing that if she opened her eyes, she would see that doll standing at the foot of her bed, smiling, with Sarah's lifeless eyes staring back at her. And she knew, deep down, that the doll-maker's curse would never let them go. And so the story ends, with Julia haunted by the memory of Sarah and the curse that had claimed her.